Luigi, what's up?
Joe, nice to see you.
Good to see you. So on the Data Nerd Herd today, got Luigi Patruno. For people who don't know who you are, do you want to give a quick intro?
Yeah, sure. So, name is Luigi Patruno. I'm currently senior director of data science at an education technology company called 2U. Um, but I'm a bit more well known, I guess, and even that is probably boasting more than I should for having started the blog mlmproduction.com, which is I started a couple of years ago and is focused on basically, you know, what are the actual questions and pain points in bringing machine learning based products and infrastructures into production settings and actually generating real value from machine learning.
Interesting. I think you were one of the first people talking about this. I would say vocally. That is machine learning in production. A couple years ago. I guess what out of all the topics in the world that you could cover, why then and that topic?
Yeah, good question. I think it's a kind of a fairly simple answer, to be honest. It's sort of a two-part answer. But at the time, I was getting more and more interested in sort of creating a little bit of an online side hustle or an online business, and really building an audience. And when I was trying to figure out what kind of audience I should build and what I should write about, I'm one of those people that has a really hard time doing something unless I'm really, really interested in it.
Mhm.
And I couldn't imagine myself just sort of picking a random topic and writing about that random topic. Even if that would have been a useful thing to do, I just don't think I would have stuck with it. Instead, what I was already doing was spending a lot of time learning about production machine learning because that's what I was doing for my day job. I had already joined 2U by that point, and at that time I was an individually contributing data scientist. But the data science team at 2U was really focused on end-to-end model building. So we not only built the models, but we also had to deploy those models, make sure that our predictions were being utilized by other downstream consumers. In some cases, really build the entire product, not just the data pipeline and data infrastructure. And we were scaling up those efforts at the time. And prior to that job, I had also worked as a machine learning engineer at a startup and a data engineer at a previous startup. Uh, and pretty much at all times, just really thinking about how to solve these very practical questions and challenges when it came to, utilizing machine learning in production settings. So, I was interested in learning how to do more of that and how to do it better. And I often think one of the, best ways to answer most questions is just by doing a little bit of research and seeing what people who have come before you have already done. So I had been spending a lot of time reading articles, blog posts, looking for content. And basically at that point, there was this convergence of, okay, I want to, do some content creation online and content curation online, build an audience. And I'm already doing a lot of reading and sharing of information that has to do with production machine learning. So why not just combine the two things?
That's really cool. It's an interesting way to kind of scratch your own itch and also develop it and say expertise in the field.
Yep.
Um, I guess what about the content at the time that you were finding? Was it good or low quality or what kind of prompted you to take the next step and start generating your own and curating as
Yeah.
well?
Yeah. So what I actually started with was the curation. And the reason I started with that is, I just found it a little bit easier to look across content that already exists and basically send that out to people rather than write my own. At the time, I remember being very hesitant to write my own blog posts, uh, somewhat because I felt like I didn't have much to say, um, and some other part because I was sort of worried about the time commitment.
Mhm.
So just curating content was a sort of a good way for me to get started. And another reason why I thought it was a value add was because it took me a lot of time to actually find good content related to productionizing machine learning. I think this was around like 2019, 2018 when I started. And not that companies, you know, weren't doing this sort of work. I'm sure plenty of companies were doing this sort of work outside of the sort of giants like Google and Facebook. but there was very few people who were writing about what it took this to do this sort of work. So there was the typical like couple of good company blog posts, which were, you know, filled with a couple of like nice, bites of information, but nothing got very specific because these were all sort of like proprietary company secrets and that sort of thing. Really just enough clickbait to make people want to apply for a job at the company, let's say.
I think I know some of
And
the articles you might be talking about.
sure.
Was one of them the Uber Michelangelo article?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I think those posts still provide a lot of value. I don't want to
Yeah.
like, totally poo-poo them, but they still don't get into like very specific things that
Right.
you can walk away with and like, okay, I know I can do this now.
Yeah.
So reading, there was those types of posts, and there was the occasional paper you would read that would give you a lot of actionable advice. But beyond that, there was really, you were really looking for these like sort of value assets amongst the whole bunch, where there was a relatively little that was said that was really useful for anybody beyond like an absolute beginner in terms of productionizing machine learning models. Like you would find many blog posts for how to launch like a Flask app that allowed you to query a
Right.
model. But even those posts, the Flask app would always be in like dev mode or something. So you couldn't even actually serve those predictions using those posts. But um, I think I saw the service I was providing there as I'm going to do the hours of research to find these posts, and not just like do a Google search and um, you know send out whatever I found, but I wound up reading many blog posts and discarding many of them. Many of them did not make sort of my email blast, my weekly email blast of 5 articles that were had a couple sentences description for each of them. So I wound up reading like hundreds, if not thousands, of blog posts and journal papers and articles and all that sort of stuff over the past couple of years, purely for the newsletter. But that wound up doubling for my education as well.
It's a good investment though. And I think I read a lot of articles too. Even just getting the list that you want to read is challenging, I think, at least for me. I mean, how do you did you find yourself getting better at curating content over time, or walk me through the process of curating articles? Because it sounds simple on the surface, like you would just read a bunch. But was there any like method to how you went about doing that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Nobody has asked me that before, but sort of behind the scenes, I am really proud of like the system I came up with for going through this content and annotating it and taking notes on it and making those notes sort of like searchable, I would say. I think there's a lot of people sort of thinking about these types of like building knowledge graph questions from your own notes and that sort of stuff. Like I think Zettelkasten or is the term or something like that. But basically, what I started out with is I love using Markdown files. I love taking notes. I just love Markdown as a format, and I would basically spend some when I first started. I would dedicate like 15 minutes a night or something to just Google searching and then categorizing the content I found. And I would categorize both like functionally. And what I mean by that is like, is it a YouTube video? Is it audio? Is it a short blog post? Is it a journal paper? Or is it like a piece of academic literature? So like more of like what exactly is how is the message being produced? And then I would also categorize by specific tags of the subject matter. So are we dealing with model monitoring, or are we dealing with experimentation articles? Is this posted by a specific company? If so, what company, what industry? I tried doing the industry thing, but I wound up like dropping that after a while. Um, and then the flow I started getting into, and the format of my newsletter was relatively constant the entire time I was doing it. It was basically I would write like a 500 to 600 words, uh, like some thoughts, and then I would present 5 pieces of content that I had consumed over the course of the past week or 2 weeks, and I would describe that content in a couple of sentences for the reader. And there wasn't really a theme to the content I would share, but it usually actually followed topics that I was actually interested in at that time for my day job. Because again, I was doing these things, and it was useful education for me to go through a lot of this content on my own. And what eventually I wound up evolving into this sort of system where each morning before I started my day job, I would read one or two of these articles and then do the annotation, do the note taking, and basically write up the couple of sentences for each article, so that by the time I got around to the weekend, that part of the newsletter was done, and I would just have to write out the 400 to 600 words in the
Wow.
sort of like preamble. And that basically, I did that for like, I think it was about 90 total issues over the course of 2 years. So I took off a couple of weeks now and then, but it's fairly consistent. And I would read through the sort of issues from the earlier days, and I could tell how much my writing improved, and how much the content improved, and also how much my system for categorizing things changed over time. But that wound up being data that then I used when doing some sort of product development. I put out a course, I did some other forms of content, and I would actually look at like statistics and data on those newsletters and what seems to get traction, and use that in other sorts of ways for MLM production.
It's really cool. I mean, what did you find got more traction than others?
So there, it was interesting to see topics that were not really well discussed at all get traction. Like specifically, one of the topics I remember getting a lot of traction early on was model monitoring, and I think part of the reason for that is, I've really built this sort of audience, or built. I think built is maybe too strong a word. No, let's say collected people over time, um, of actual practitioners, right? People were really not interested in the fluff content that
Eh,
is easy to find. Like there were actually people. I got so many emails from people, especially in the early days of like CEOs, CTOs of startups who are like, yeah, we're doing this thing, and they're like, we love your stuff. We it's really hard to find this sort of content, and we love what you're doing. I actually got taken out to dinner by like a CEO and CTO of a machine learning software, uh, uh, like how do I describe it? Like platform esque company,
mhm.
because they happens to be in New York. They were from. I lived in New York at the time. They weren't from New York, but they happened to be in town for a conference, and they were like, "Hey, we love your stuff. Can we take you to dinner?" I was like,
That's
"Yeah,
so
that
cool.
sure." Yeah, it was just very it was unexpected, but it was very cool to see the amount of engagement and the metrics on the actual newsletter, like open rates and click rates, comparing to the industry standards. I think was like pretty off the charts. I was getting a lot of engagement uh, from the reader base, which was also interesting and humbling, and also gave me more motivation to keep doing it.
That's really cool. Huh. Wait, what are some trends that you've seen? I guess since the time you started the newsletter to today, like what are maybe some of the more macro trends you've seen in machine learning, like I guess production machine learning in
Yeah, yeah.
general?
Well, it seems like the industry has matured to the extent that these topics that I was researching and was having a really hard time finding any content about, be that fluff or not fluff, just like anything. There's certainly a lot more content out there and a lot more people speaking about these topics. I think that has sort of coincided with just the number of startups that have emerged doing some of these things. Like there's more model monitoring startups. There's more like data cataloging things. These sorts of like these companies didn't exist 2 years ago, at least not that I'm aware of. And each of these companies has a little bit of a content marketing play attached to it. So just the overall amount of content I think has grown quite rapidly in the last 2 years. Um, I think there's also been like sort of some interest in maybe more job recs are posting, like, you have to know how to productionize models and do quote unquote ML ops. And I think that has just led directly to the creation of more clickbaity things and more people who are looking for jobs, writing blog posts on the topics to help them get jobs, and which is good. But um, you know, I definitely see, like, I think I was in a niche space when I started, and I think somebody who starts writing about this topic today, it would be a whole lot less sort of like, it would be harder to it would you'd have more competition, let's say, if you started
Mhm.
today in this space.
Yeah.
That said, uh, there's no competition for somebody who's doing something of high quality.
Right.
So if you can put together quality stuff, doesn't matter how many other people are writing about it, you'll probably stick out.
That's a hugely valuable point, right? I mean, it still happens, right? You have sports writers, for example. I mean, it's not like the field of sports is it's super saturated with people who write about it, but people rise to the top, and I think almost every industry is like that. Finance, and I'm glad to see there's more content on production ML. There, to your point, there really wasn't for a really long time, and it was kind of concerning, I think, for a bit, because it's like, well, I mean, it seemed like the zeitgeist was, especially a couple of years ago. I'm kind of thinking maybe 2015 to 2019 or maybe 2020-ish, but it was like, um, how do you train models? And like you said, the canonical Flask examples. I was like, is this what people are actually doing in production? Because I've done machine learning in production. I don't think this is how you would do it. So it was kind of concerning if this is what people were basing their architectures on. But it definitely seems to have matured, even over the last year. So like the MLOps community,
Yeah,
for example, how we got introduced. I mean, that was
right.
a year old and it's exploded.
Yeah.
So
They're doing, the MLOps community is doing great stuff, and I agree. I think it does extend to 2020, because I remember having at least an entire year where still other people weren't writing about this sort of stuff. Actually, I spoke at TWIMLCon 2019,
hmm,
and I remember randomly finding out about the conference. And that stood out to me because up until that point, I hadn't heard of any conferences or sort of more, I don't want to say corporate because like Twimmel is not really like corporate, but more, let's say, established players
yeah.
talking about platforms and productionization. And I remember just like, I need to apply to this because this is what I do. And luckily I was selected to speak. But that was at the end, that was at the tail end of the year. And so this is just to say that, yeah, this is not until very recently have things changed in this space, and I agree with you. It's a good showing. I do think it has to do with just the maturity cycle of companies who are doing this sort of work.
Hmm,
Algorithms were interesting. Algorithms got all the attention at first because that's just what people were doing.
hmm,
Nobody was putting anything into production. They were just like, going to managers with their POCs and saying like, hey, I could predict this thing. And then managers were like, okay, let's, can we actually use any of this stuff? And then naturally deployment became the important question. And now that models have been out there for a while, you're like, okay, how do we continuously operate models? Like MLOps is becoming more important.
hmm.
I think it's just sort of like there were relatively few companies who were doing this well in the early days, a couple of years ago, and naturally it was sort of like proprietary information that
Yeah.
gave competitive edge. So nobody was publishing. Google doesn't publish papers on their ad systems very frequently because
Right.
that would not be a great thing to do from a business perspective. So similarly, that Google has had feature stores and model monitoring systems for quite some time now. So it's not like these things didn't exist before. It's just that more people need to do these things now. So there are more people with that knowledge in their head, and more people with that knowledge in their head who also want to write it down on the internet.
Hmm. It definitely seems like these techniques are becoming more approachable by smaller companies, whereas in the past, it was it was just hidden. You wouldn't even know where to begin, who to ask. Now it seems to be more democratized. I don't know if that's the right word for it, but
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you to some extent.
uh-huh.
I think the sort of some platform vendors have made it easier to do certain things.
Right.
That said, I think there are still some things that no one is doing well, at
Hmm,
least no one that I've come across. Like the model and monitoring question, I think there's
hmm,
a couple of startups competing for for markets, for market, market space there. But let's say, uh, I think a good indicator of how democratized something is in let's say, you know, tech is whether you can feasibly build something reasonable with just open source components. And, it doesn't need to be like the only system you use, but whether you can just like duct tape something together to work for like a POC or like a simple production use case, I think tells you how sort of widely spread the information in that space is. And in something like model monitoring, I don't think you can do that well at all with any open source components.
Hmm.
And like, first of all, it's very complicated. It requires like, you know, good infrastructure, like just pure data flow pipelines and like, streaming metrics and that sort of stuff, like the typical, like what a good data engineer knows about, and or like a cloud architect who knows the AWS ecosystem very well. You need to be able to do that. And that's why if you look in that space, you're going to see, the equivalent of like the Flask blog post from the model deployment side, I think is how to get a Prometheus and Grafana dashboard on the model monitoring side. Like I've seen a couple of those posts
Yeah.
now, and like they're valuable in the sense that if you've never done this before, here's how to do it, walk through the demo, fine. But it still doesn't really get to the question of model monitoring, which is a much more like data specific statistical question, which is how can you, if you have models, for example, how can you like very with a reasonable set of defaults measure distances between distributions of data,
Hmm.
right? Like this is by no means a trivial question, yet that is, in my opinion, the central question you need to answer when it comes to monitoring like the degradation of a machine learning model over time. And from what I've seen, there's no one who there's no open source tool that does this well. And there are some vendors, but I don't, I haven't tested every vendor, so I can't have
Right.
an opinion on vendors.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So seems like it's definitely so early days. Like right before we started, I was just reading an article on ML observability and maybe some myths around it. Who was it by Arise, I think it was.
Okay.
So yeah, anyway, but the only thing I took from it really was it still seems super early. So but yeah, no, I think it's a good point. Like maybe these tools are around, but I guess it's the old saying, right? The future's here, but it's not evenly distributed yet. So it might apply to ML tools because there are different facets. I think is what you're saying too, where it's um, like setting up, like deploying models might be like easier-ish than monitoring
Yep.
them. So yeah,
Yep.
I think it's fair.
Yeah. Speak a little bit about in my day job now. I'm doing a lot less of the implementation, but I do a lot of the
Hmm.
design of the system still. And I have a team of people who work on different parts of these pipelines. And when we productionize a model, we build the pipelines, we do the actual deployment, we do data quality checks, so monitoring the quality of the input data. We do some monitoring of the output data, but and we, for some of it, we have like a platform that we use, but we also do some open source stuff, build some internal things, and from that perspective, there are things that are significantly easier now than they were a couple of years ago. You need a lot less boilerplate code to do some things like you know batch prediction or even online inference in a lot of cases. But there are a lot of other pieces where you know you have much less. It's a lot harder to do the work, and you sort of do as much as you can, but then you have to move on to other tasks or other projects and that sort of thing.
Interesting. What's it like now being a manager as opposed to being an individual contributor?
Yeah, I love it. I
It's
think I'm
cool.
a much better. I think I'm a much better manager than I was individual contributor. And that
Interesting.
said, yeah, I think it's allowed me to realize my potential much more. But that said, I was like, I had those same concerns that I think a lot of technical people have, which is, oh, I'm gonna, not be actually click clacking the code, and I'm gonna be sad about that. And I think for like a period of time I was, but I think I'm a very naturally I'm a like a problem solver. And I think that's why I think that's what kept me away from the algorithm stuff when I was started writing or even like reading content, is because I was much more focused on like what was the problem that we're actually solving. And I don't care if we use like logistic regression or, if you just take historical averages and it works well enough, that's good for me. And because of that, when I transitioned now that I've been a manager I've actually been a manager now for longer than I was an individual contributor, which
Oh, that's
is kind of
cool.
funny. I had this sort of discussion with my manager a couple of weeks ago, and I think if you're a problem solver, being a manager is a really natural thing because there are so many more challenges that you have to deal with, that some of which are very technical, some of which are less technical. Are more like project management, obviously the people management side, but you have much more leverage in actually making sure that the shit gets done.
Right.
And I think that's what I enjoy about the job. That said, I also really enjoyed like teaching. I taught for a couple of years, and I really enjoy the people management because I, first of all, luckily have a great team of people who work really hard. And you know, my favorite part of teaching when I taught was teaching the best students, because when they were the most engaged, and I just feel like I'm getting a chance to work with and teach like quote unquote the best students in my employees, many of which know more than I do in many different areas, but like it's that sort of dynamic that I really enjoy. So the combination of like the getting stuff done and really executing on a project, as well as like working with people and really in one-on-one ways is I think I'm I enjoy it.
That's really cool. And it's great too. You feel like the management was a good transition. It's such a crapshoot sometimes with technical individual contributors and moving into management. I've seen it go both ways, and sometimes not so good. So
No, definitely.
glad
Yeah,
it
I
worked
mean,
out.
I think for people who I think if you're not, I was always sort of drawn to it. So I didn't know if I was going to like it, but I was at least drawn to trying it out.
Right.
I think there are many people who aren't even drawn to trying it out, but feel compelled to do it in order to make more money or to move up,
Hmm.
and you know I I, I do think in those cases it probably won't work out because
Right.
it is demanding, although in a different way than being like a really strong individual contributor. And that's why I'm really glad to see the emergence of these sort of like staff engineering roles and these
Hmm.
like principal engineering roles that are, you're continuing to progress in your career, and there's like a path for you if you're more interested in the individual contributor route, and you can like sort of take that as far as it goes. I think that's a really strong positive for the industry.
It really is. 'Cause I think for the longest time, the only path you had to career progression was just being a manager. And I would
Right.
say, I hate to say it, but I think 8 times out of 10, that person, most people just shouldn't manage. It takes a certain, it takes a really special person. I know it sounds kind of cliche, but I think the things you pointed out though, right? Mentoring people, teaching them, putting your team first, letting them become the greatest that they can be. Like these are,
Yep.
if you're a strong individual contributor, it's almost counterintuitive, and it works against the nature that you've just had. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah. I mean, I
hard.
think like I think whenever you have, right, like humanity is very malleable, or like water in some ways, and when you can create more sort of grooves to allow people to flow into, like most of the time that's really going to be helpful. And I think that that having that staff engineer, or having that a career progression for people to continue to challenge themselves and grow in certain ways that is more conducive to themselves, I think is very important, right? You like I believe pretty strongly that you know some people are better suited to do certain things than other people,
Mhm.
which unfortunately today saying something like that could get you canceled. But the like some people should be some people just don't want to be managers, so
Mhm.
that person shouldn't feel compelled to become a manager because they have no other way of making more money, for example.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It sucks too because all that, if you do have a really strong individual contributor, right, and that person becomes a manager, and in a lot of cases, depending on the type of company, that skill set's I wouldn't say gone, but it's not being utilized to the best it could,
Correct.
right? And that's
Yeah.
that's tremendous talent that was just put on ice. So
Yeah. Yeah.
so
And I think something that's also interesting, and it was certainly a belief I may have had at some point, but it's been sort of extinguished from my mind, is that managers don't do technical work.
right.
I think in some ways, I think my work is more technical today than it was when I was an individual contributor.
Hmm.
Albeit I need to be broader and not deeper.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned architecting, right? That's
Right.
a that's that's a skill set in itself, and it's hard.
Yep.
It's
Yeah.
really hard to.
I spend most of my technical cycles understanding basically how feasible it would be to build something new in a reasonable amount of time.
Hmm.
And then if we do figure out that we should build this thing, how to go about designing it so that it's reliable, fault tolerant, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. I mean, walk me through that process of architecting systems, because it's, especially in ML right now, I don't know that there's really any rubrics to, correctly architect,
Sure.
kind of a generic system. How do you think about these kind of architectural decisions?
Yeah, and I'll preface by saying I'm not really formally trained in this stuff. I just
Hmm.
picked up a lot of things along the way, and the way I tend to think about it is, again, just like, what are we trying to? I start with the question of, like, what are we trying to do, and what are the constraints that we're imposing on what we're trying to do? Because I think the constraints are, I don't have really a negative connotation of constraints. I think constraints are good things that really just that reduce the search space of solutions that you need to consider. And once you have those constraints in place, it's just about sort of satisfying those constraints. And so, first of all, for like in machine learning, a lot of the systems you're building are responsible for, ingesting certain inputs and then producing certain outputs. Sometimes those outputs are going to be used by other people, or sometimes those outputs are going to be used by downstream software systems. So, like, first off, it's figuring out like what the boundaries of your new system with these other systems is, what that boundary looks like, and how you should communicate between those boundaries. Sometimes that means, what's the exact interface, what's the mechanism to pass the data back and forth. And I think that's one of the first questions I try to answer, which is like, where are we going to be getting data from? Do we need to build batch processes? Can we just read the data from a database? Are we getting it from some other upstream data producer? Do we need to actually produce this data ourselves, be it through some of our own batch processes, or make it available in some sort of more streaming fashion using some other technologies? Then the systems that are going to be ingesting data from our system, what do they need to expect? What are the latency constraints there, and so forth? And once that sort of like boundary is defined, I think you can get to building out the sort of black box underneath the hood. I think the idea of abstraction is very powerful, basically at any level. So whether it's like developing an individual class within an application in code, or whether it's designing a system, you can sort of think of the same approach, right? Like, when you're developing code, you want to define your interface, which is like what the function is going to return and what it's going to consume. And then when you're implementing it, you think about like, the internals of the function. And similarly, you can think about designing systems in the same way. Uh, and once you're talking about the internals of the system, um, I think there's a couple of, I'm a really strong proponent of this idea of like pipelines, and pipelines can be implemented using workflow managers. And I think if you have a system that makes that easy to do, you can also have sort of relatively, data scientists who might be relatively inexperienced software engineers actually do a lot more than they might otherwise be capable of if there weren't these sort of this platform or some framework in place. So a lot of times for us, it comes down to mapping out the boundary of the system and then thinking through how we can implement this in a pipeline of steps. So I think that's it doesn't cover all cases, obviously, but
Yeah.
I think that that's a framework that's helped me and my team out a lot.
It's cool. Do you have data engineers in your team, or do your data scientists cover a lot of the data engineering work as well?
So we don't have data engineers on my team, but we do have a separate data engineering team.
Okay,
But the data science, my team, the data science team, is responsible for, in many cases, we'll build ETLs or processes to
cool.
clean or ingest data and that sort of thing. Ideally, depending on the data set and the level of transformation, sometimes we'll work with a data engineering team. Sometimes we'll do it ourselves. It really depends on the task. I mean, I do like having the freedom to do that work if we need, and I think that pays off at times.
Interesting. Yeah, I've been trying to think of the dynamic between data engineers and data science and ML teams. I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I actually read a good blog post, I think 2 weeks ago. It was by Lashlow something. I think he was interviewed on the ML ops community as well. I
Oh,
forget his last name.
Laszlo
Yeah.
starts with an S. His last name again.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He wrote a post on like the three types of roles you need in data, and it was something like data scientists, data engineers, and data analysts, or something like that. But he had I really liked his categorization of you want to have a team that is based. There's like three qualities, like autonomous. I forget exactly, but the idea being basically that you want to give each of these teams as much autonomy as possible to do what they do best. And he had a really nice formulation of how to split the data engineering work from the data science work. And to some extent, it was like the data engineers worry about like the warehouse, and getting data into and out of the warehouse, basically. And there was a couple of other things, obviously, but I don't recall them.
Yeah.
But I think having a strong data engineering operation is extremely important to doing any form of modeling that gets used in anything besides ad hoc reports.
Right.
Right. So if you need to have models that produce outputs that are used by other software systems or used by decision systems, or that data just doesn't only wind up in a PowerPoint, then you need to have a really strong data engineering team, not just for getting the data to those places, but just architecting the overall level of data flows in a company. And
Hmm.
companies, the amount of data that's generated by the different you know products and integrations and CRMs, marketing tools that now, like, many, very, very many companies use, is just absolutely insane. And you know you know I I'll be quite honest. I think my data engineering chops aren't quite what they used to be, so I'm certainly not like up to speed with some of the modern tools that I think are gaining more and more traction among data engineers, like things like Fivetran and Stitcher and all of these things. That I see those names a lot, but I don't know what they do.
Right.
And it's that is a very, very important, and I think data engineers are certainly have job security for quite a long time, given the growing importance of data engineering.
Yeah, it seems to be. I have sometimes a hard time wondering if there's a parallel path between ML engineering and data engineering, or if the two are ever going to sort of intersect. So,
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I, thing is, it depends on like whether this person is doing modeling or not.
mhm.
But even then, having an understanding of what like machine learning is doing in general, I think there are plenty of ML engineering tasks that a data engineer couldn't do, who a data engineer who didn't have some machine learning background couldn't do, like debugging certain things. I think if you have that ML knowledge is way I'd much rather have an ML engineer debugging a pipeline than just like a talented data engineer who doesn't know machine learning.
Right. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I'm kind of curious where it all goes. Except it seems like even, you talk about ML engineering sort of just coming into its own. I feel the same way about data engineering, even though there's been some variations of it for, decades. Whether you're talking ETL developer, BI engineer, data warehouse administrator, or whatever. It's all these are sort of lumped into data engineering now. But then there's also, like I said, this kind of Venn diagram almost of like ML data. We'll see.
Sure, sure.
Yeah, it's awesome. Kind of switching gears a bit. I mean, you just recently moved to San Diego. Congrats
Yep.
on moving to one of those beautiful cities in the world. So,
Thank you. Thank you. I'm taking a lot of credit for the beauty of the city. The no, the yeah, we moved in gosh, it was September, October of 2020.
interesting.
So yeah, it was we didn't move, we being my partner and I, and our baby as well. Baby was born by that point. We didn't move for COVID related reasons. We had actually already been planning to move, from we had decided to move in September, like the previous September, and then COVID hit in like early 2020, and I just doubled down on making sure that we moved,
Cool.
because I was in New York City, and I was really ready to get out of New York City. Had been there my entire life. Basically, I was born and raised there, and just the thought of having a COVID winter with a new baby in our like 2 bedroom apartment in Queens was so depressing to me, and I knew I needed to, to do what it took to get out of there, even with COVID.
Smart.
I would have paid whatever premium to the moving companies and that sort of thing. I just wanted, I wanted out.
Interesting. Um, what do you think so far? Do you like it? San
Yeah,
Diego is
I love San Diego so far.
it's
I
cool.
mean, the weather is awesome. Uh, I'm somebody who, like, was always in the city, so I'm just not, I'm getting very used to, and I love it. Just the sound of quiet,
Hmm.
like
Yeah.
I'm used to like fire trucks and ambulances and people honking all the time. And now I live in like a nice little suburb, and it's beautiful, and it's nice and quiet, and I get, you know, as good sleep as my 1-year-old allows me to get.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, but yeah, we love it so far, and I'm into a lot of sports, and surfing, and hiking and that sort of thing. So it's just really
Cool.
nice.
Yeah, I think if you live in San Diego, like the rule is you have to surf and eat burritos and tacos all the time. So
Yeah, I'm I'm happy to take on that responsibility.
awesome. And you're into jujitsu as well, right?
Yeah, I'm into jujitsu and mixed martial arts generally, and
Nice.
started out with doing Muay Thai a couple years ago,
Cool.
Thai boxing, and so I really like striking. I like grappling as well, but I think I'm more naturally, my affinity is towards striking.
Hmm.
But yeah, I've been doing some jujitsu here in San Diego.
It's a lot of good jujitsu gyms there. So a lot of
Yeah,
good striking gyms too. So
yeah, I think California is pretty strong on the jujitsu.
it is. It's ridiculous. I mean,
There's I think
it landed in California back in the day with the Gracies.
Oh,
So
okay.
yeah,
I didn't know that was the case. Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
it's there's a lot of jujitsu here. I actually find I'm having, I think partially for COVID, but having more trouble finding like a good striking spot. But I'm
Hmm.
gonna I'm gonna be checking out a couple new gyms in the near future, so I'm excited about that.
Yeah, yeah. There's yeah. I think it's the other rule of living in San Diego is you have to do either Muay Thai or Jiu-Jitsu. So it's like
Perfect.
everybody I know there does jits. It's pretty funny.
Oh, okay,
So
awesome.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
it's
There's
good.
like
But you're at the 10th Planet Gym, I think, right?
Yeah, yeah. I've been doing 10th Planet Jiu-Jitsu, and I think it's been a great introduction to Jiu-Jitsu. Some really good people. Um, the head coach is Richie Boogeyman Martinez, who's
Mm.
an Eddie Bravo black belt.
Yep.
So he's it's pretty scary when it comes to jiu-jitsu. But yeah, it's been a lot of fun. It's very different from striking.
Hmm.
Definitely very different from Muay Thai in that if you do Muay Thai, you basically walk out of any. I mean, you're lucky if you walk out of a class. Like you're crawling out of class, or you're just so exhausted from throwing so many kicks. And
Hmm.
if you spar, like you get relatively beat up
Yep.
in Muay Thai. It's pretty brutal, I would say. Um, Whereas in jujitsu, at least at the 10th planet I go to, pretty much half the class is just like drilling, or
Yeah.
maybe more than half the class is just sort of just very, it could be as fast as you want, but typically you just like go through the motions first to really learn the sequence. And then you spend like the last 15 or 20 minutes or 10 minutes like actually rolling.
Hmm.
And so, that like 15 minutes is pretty hard. Obviously, like, you're getting choked out. So it's not, at least I'm getting choked out. So it's not easy, but I think there's much more conservation of energy in the class than there is in something like Muay Thai, where like, you start Muay Thai class, the instructor's like, okay, throw 100 roundhouse kicks
Yeah.
as your warm up.
Well, and you got to
You're
throw it pretty hard too, right?
yeah. I mean, you're floored. You're floored in the warm up.
Hmm. Yeah, I always found like Muay Thai was it's one of the best cardio workouts there is,
Yeah,
but I always
yeah,
found
yeah.
my shins were just beat to hell because
Yes.
either if you're sparring, getting leg checked a lot or whatever, it's hard.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, definitely. I think the cardio, you know, I think my impression of martial arts is definitely biased because of the fact that I started Muay Thai. So I was
mhm.
almost like expecting that cardio and anything else. And then I think I went to Jiu-Jitsu, and again, I haven't tried out other things, but it seemed like way opposite end of the cardio spectrum, at least from the non-rolling aspects of the class.
Mhm.
But it's cool.
Yeah, I think jiu-jitsu definitely lends itself to I think kind of uh, you'll be aggressive when you need to, but then you also really relax because
Yes,
you should be.
conserve energy. Yeah,
Like I know some wrestlers that when they start jiu-jitsu, for example, it becomes like they go in and the wrestler's tendency is just to like pounce on you
kill.
and just
Yeah,
like wait them out. I'm like, okay, I'll
yeah,
just let you get
yeah.
tired.
I remember I
So,
rolled with a wrestler who had just started jiu-jitsu, and like I was on my back pretty like instantly,
yeah.
which is fine. Like I like playing the back game, and but he was just going so hard, like just trying to smashing me,
Uh-huh.
and like I wound up tapping him. Luckily, I had a couple more weeks on him, so it was pretty cool. But I just remember thinking like, damn, this guy's going so hard.
Uh-huh.
You know?
That's what they do. That's what they do. And but the nice thing is, as you point out, you had 2 weeks on it. I mean, a wrestler who has no grappling,
Oh yeah,
or at least no submission skill is it's still fair game. Once they get
yeah,
submissions, though, I mean, now it's game over for you because
yes,
they know how to use their pressure really, really well. So I've been in so
yeah,
many situations with wrestlers. I'm like, I just hope this guy gets tired soon because
yeah.
I'm it's how much I'm
And
gonna do.
if he's a good wrestler, he probably won't get tired.
Nope. So you just gotta figure out a way to sub. So
Yeah.
that's awesome. So I guess what's next for you? Anything interesting?
Yeah. So, you know, I paused my work on MO production a couple months ago, mostly out of just like a time commitment. I'd been my team at 2U got larger, and I got promoted, so I had more responsibilities. And I actually want to. I think part of it was like I said, like I started the podcast. Like I really enjoy doing writing or doing something when I'm like totally into it, and otherwise it's really hard for me to motivate myself to do the things that I don't want to do, which is true and is not true. I have a lot of discipline, but like sometimes when it comes to certain things, I'm just not interested in having the discipline.
Right.
And I was writing about a lot of production machine learning stuff, and a lot of tools and code stuff. But now that I find myself sort of away from that layer in my day to day job, I'm much less interested in going through those like hundreds or thousands of blog posts or pieces of content, and thinking most of the time about that sort of stuff, because I just don't do it anymore as much in my day job. And in fact, I spend most of my time, like architecting or doing people management, or I've actually been spending a lot more of my time recently, less on machine learning questions and more on just general experimentation questions,
That's
like A/B
cool.
testing and that sort of infrastructure. And I think that's an interesting space as well for the person who's interested in designing and architecting, because first of all, like in like the data science world, there's way more experiments that are run than machine learning stuff that's done, because you don't need to be doing machine learning to be testing out different ideas and with experiments. And also, I think it's much harder to generalize the infrastructure for experimentation than it is to generalize the infrastructure for like production for
Mm.
productionizing machine learning models, because a lot of the work in experimentation is, sure, there are the easy parts like variant assignment, how to put somebody in a treatment versus a control, and then logging all that data, but then tying that data to the specific ways that your company stores its metrics or
Mm.
the specific systems that your company is actually experimenting on. That's so company specific that it's hard to basically build one tool that everybody can use.
Right.
So I've been spending a lot of my time thinking about that, and from a design perspective and engineering perspective. And I'm still thinking about doing some more writing or getting back to it, albeit it'll be in a little bit of a different vein. But I'm actively thinking right now about like, do I want to write about some experimentation stuff and my experiences there? I think if I get back to writing soon, it'll be more about my recent experiences,
Hmm.
and like sort of tips for people doing this for the first time. I think those types of things are always very useful, and in my experience, people have enjoyed those blog posts where I really write from experience and like you know give war stories from having done that work.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'd love to read, whatever you have. So,
Awesome.
like I said, I like reading these war stories too because they're so unique to the individual. But I think there's a lot of lessons to be gleaned. I tend to shy away from kind of overarching tutorials, for example, just because it assumes that this is going to work every single time, and sometimes they do. In a lot of cases, especially with something like experiments, by definition, it's hard to paint a broad brush on that. So yeah, I'd love to,
Yeah.
maybe have you back on too when you get some material written.
Awesome.
Yeah. So I think, as you point out, I think your intuition is correct. Where there's this might actually be the kind of the next phase of what people will be talking about after sort of the productionizing machine learning discussions become a bit more mature, right? Because at the end of the day, I think you hit it on the head. That's exactly what people are really striving to do, is just experiment, but
Yep.
experiment well with machine learning. So
Yeah.
that's cool.
Yeah.
It's a good
Yeah.
insight.
Especially when it comes down to like this question of like causality
Mm-hmm.
and like, does this predictive model actually help my business solve this problem in a certain way and cause some outcome? I think it's necessary for ML, and I do see, like in the newsletters I still get from others, I'm starting to see an increase in the amount of like causal inference and
Mm-hmm.
that sort of thing. And that's partially probably because I've been searching for that stuff, so my bias is towards recognizing it more. But it is interesting to see how that will develop.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. Well, for people who want to know more about you and get a hold of you, how would they do that?
Yeah, check out mlmproduction.com if you want to read some of my stuff and see what I've have spent some time writing about. I've done a bunch of talks like this or podcasts, so I have a YouTube channel and I usually post them there, but I'll be posting them on my blog as well. Otherwise, if you just want to reach out to me, I'm on Twitter at mlmproduction. So,
Awesome. Well, Luigi, it's been fun. So
all right, thanks a lot, Joe.
yeah,
Thanks
of
for
course.
having
Yeah.
me.
We'll talk to you later, man. See ya.
Bye bye.